Today I'm making Christmas stockings, and I'm going to show you how to make Christmas stockings too, so you can have a fabulous homemade Christmas. Traditionally, Christmas stockings are made out of very luxe materials such as velvet, silk, and fur. But you can use whatever materials you want, and sometimes satin and brocade look really lovely as Christmas stockings as well. For my Christmas stockings, I'm going to be using this gorgeous Italian velveteen scrap fabric that I dug out of my stash. I have no idea where it came from or when my aunt bought it, but I just know it is gorgeous. I have two slightly different colored reds, and I have a lovely brown velvet that I'm going to use as the cuff on both stockings. I also picked up some gold beads and gold embroidery thread because I want to embroider initials on all of the stockings. And make sure you use embroidery needles if you're going to be using embroidery floss because they have a wider eye for you to slide the thicker embroidery thread through. Pinking shears are going to be your friend with this project. Most of the materials you're going to be using on your stockings will fray very easily, and the jagged edges on the pinking shears will help reduce fraying. Also, grab yourself a lint roller if you're working with velvet because it does shed a lot. And as always, don't forget to grab your pins, your measuring tape, and your matching thread. You can always find a pattern for stockings, but it's really easy to make your own. Just draft a simple boot or sock. I'm gonna make mine with a heel on it, and cut a matching piece for the cuff at the top. In general, you want your stocking to be at least a foot tall, and you want the opening to be about 8 inches wide. You can make it wider if you want, but you do want it to be wide enough to put gifts in. And it doesn't really matter how wide you make the toe. That's all up to personal preference. So let's get started making our Christmas stockings. I have just enough fabric to squeeze 2 boots out of this bright red fabric if I use a very narrow seam allowance. And I want to use a very narrow seam allowance on my stocking anyway, because when you sew around the corners and the curved parts of the stocking or boot, you want it to be very thin so that it sits nicely when you turn it inside out. And you can leave a wider seam allowance at the top as well. And if you are using velvet or fur for your stocking, remember that the pile, that's that fuzzy part that stands up on the fabric, is going to have a proper direction. So when you're laying your pattern pieces out, make sure the tops all face the same edge of the fabric. And you may need to use your lint roller when you're done cutting. For the cuff at the top of your stocking, you can either make 2 separate pieces and sew them along the very top of the stocking, or you can take your pattern piece, double it up so that you have a longer piece to fold over. It'll have a much nicer finish if you use that method. Since my stocking is 8 inches wide, I cut 2 8x8 inch squares for the cuff. And I cut out a little piece for the heel. I'm going to be making stripes for the second stocking. So the bottom is going to be red, the top is going to be red, the cuff is going to be brown, and I have another brown strip for the center. Making a striped stocking is a really good way to utilize the most of your fabric if you're working with scraps or a limited amount of fabric like I am. Once you have all your pattern pieces cut out, it's time to embroider the cuff of your stocking. You can always sew the stocking together before you embroider it, but it's going to be easier to embroider it first. When you're shopping around or making a pattern for the initials, just make sure the initials are at least 1 inch shorter than the total height of the cuff. Take a piece of the cuff and fold it in half. Take your initials and set them backwards on the inside of the fabric. Try to center it the best you can and make sure that you have enough room for the seam allowance at the bottom. Then trace along the edge with a pen. It can be washable, but it doesn't have to be since it will be on the inside of the fabric. Just make sure it won't bleed through. It might not show up well if you're using a really dark fabric like this one. Just do your best to make sure you have a legible outline for you to embroider with. Now it's time to get out your embroidery thread. I like a gold thread to go with red stockings, but you can also use silver or any other color if you want to. Start with a single strand of embroidery floss and make a simple running stitch along the edge of your initials. This will give you an outline from the back side and a faint outline from the outside to work with. Thread your needle with 2 strands of embroidery floss and satin stitch your letters using that running stitch as an outline. To make a satin stitch, you use the needle to loop around your design. Make your stitches nice and close together right next to each other so that they form the embroidered effect. And don't pull too hard because you don't want your fabric to warp underneath. Well, I think that looks pretty good, especially considering that's the first time I've ever actually embroidered anything, but I want to make it a little bit more fun, so I'm going to add some beads to it. Using a single strand of embroidery floss, back stitch along the edges of the letters, adding a single bead on each stitch. If you take your time, your embroidery and beading will turn out beautifully. And if you have any embroidery thread left over, you can always finger knit it into a chain and use that for the loop on your stocking to hold it up when you're done. And since glass beads can be kind of heavy, you can always interface the cuff for a little extra support. But be careful if you're using velvet because you don't want to press that iron down too hard because it can damage the pile. And once you're done embroidering and beading your initials, you are ready to sew your stocking together. I'm using a walking foot with my sewing machine to prevent the layers of velvet from slipping under the presser foot. But if you don't have a walking foot, you can always hand sew your stocking together. I started by sewing the heel of the boot first because it needs to be turned inside out and pressed before being attached to the stocking. And next I'm attaching all the tiers of the striped stocking together. And like I said when I was cutting my fabric out, I am using a pretty narrow seam allowance. Next you'll want to sew the cuff to the stocking. So line it up and then flip the cuff down and sew right sides together. And do that with both the front and the back sides. Press your seam allowance up towards the cuff and lay your stocking out flat. Fold the cuff in half to find the center. Find the middle of the cuff on the far edge and open it back up. Take your loop or hook and sew or hand baste it to that mark you just made with the tail towards the seam allowance. And you can make your loops as long or as short as you want. Anywhere between 2 to 4 inches is a good length. And before you move on to the next step, make sure you hand baste on any pieces that will be sewn into the seam allowance of the stocking, such as your boot heel. Line it up with your seam allowance pointing towards the inside of the stocking. Now you're ready to pin your stockings with the right sides together. Smooth out any wrinkles and trim off any excess fabric. Now you're ready to sew your stocking together. Start from one end of the cuff, sew all the way around the stocking, and stop at the other top of the cuff. You want to make sure that there's still a gap in the opening. That's starting to look like a Christmas stocking now, isn't it? You have 2 options for this next step. You can either finish all your seam allowances. You can do that by hand or by a machine and use whatever method you want. Or you can make a lining that will help protect the seam allowances and help your stocking to hang better. You can use whatever fabric you want for the lining. I just used a cotton bed sheet. And make sure you cut your lining to about 1 inch bigger than your stocking all the way around. Keep your stocking inside out and make it so your lining has the right side showing. And slide your stocking into the lining. Pin your lining to the seam allowance for the cuff. And since the lining is bigger than the stocking, you'll need to make a small pleat in the center. And I think it's a lot easier to sew this by hand than a machine. And this stitch doesn't have to be very strong. You can use a whip stitch or a running stitch if you want. And don't worry about making it look nice either, because this is not going to show on the final stocking. Last step, take your cuff and roll it down. Tuck the edge under and sew it to your lining. If you're not using a lining and you finished all your seams separately, then just sew your cuff to that seam allowance. You might notice that the corners bunch up a little bit, and that's because the inside of the stocking is bigger than the cuff. So smooth out the front of the stocking and the back and leave a little bunching in the corner, but don't sew through it. Leave about 1 centimeter, and then when you turn it back inside out the right way, it'll relax a little bit inside there and look nice. Now this stitch will be visible on your stocking, but most people probably won't see it. So just pick whatever stitch is comfortable for you, and if you want it to not show at all, then use a ladder stitch. I'm using a very tight little whip stitch with mine. Once you're done sewing the cuff to the lining, you are done making your Christmas stockings. Just turn them inside out and give them a good steaming or pressing. And if I haven't said it already, you can iron and steam velvet. Just don't push too hard, and make sure you use a pressing cloth on the outside of it. These are gorgeous. I love the way they came out. They're so pretty and fun and Christmassy. They're not perfect though, and that's fine because this is the first time I've ever made stockings, and it's the first time I've ever embroidered or beaded anything either. There's a few spots where the stripes don't match up, but that's all right. It's good enough, and most people aren't going to be looking at it from the back or the side anyway. And I definitely need to work on my embroidery and my beading. I could definitely make these lines a lot cleaner and straighter. These definitely have a good weight to them. Like, they're nice and sturdy, especially with that lining on the inside and the interfacing on the cuff. These are really good quality materials, so I think they're gonna hold up for a long, long time. I think this heeled boot idea is so cute, and I love the way it turned out. But I did miss a little bit of that heel in the seam, so I'm gonna have to fix that later. I should have really double checked that I got that boot heel sewn in properly before I sewed the whole stocking together. I don't know how I'm gonna fix that yet, because I really should have just double checked that I sewed it in properly the first time, and it's gonna be a little tricky to unpick that seam and sew it in properly now. I might just end up putting a little free check on it, but that might not be the best decision since it could discolor the velvet and make the pile sit weird. So that's a fix for another day, but I think it'll be okay for now. At least I matched my cuff up perfectly on this one. And even though these reds are slightly different colors, I think they still go really well together. I'm really glad I was able to use these scrap fabrics in the way that I did, because I was able to make the most of the material that I had to work with. Well, now you know how to make your own stockings, and if you made your own stockings using this tutorial, I would love to know how yours turned out. If you haven't liked this video already, make sure you do leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more Christmas content. Next week, I'll be making Christmas trees out of magazines. Thank you for watching my video, everyone. I'll see you next week.